Good evening, everybody. Welcome. We'll just start with some hellos as everybody filters in. Welcome to our Marine, Indigenous, Protected and Conserved Areas webinars, where we talk about tools for Indigenous-led conservation in the marine environment. Tonight, we're hearing from Melissa Labrador and her team on their conservation mosaic taking place here in Nova Scotia. It's really exciting. It's sort of a new idea that is wrapping up a lot of area in the South Shore and getting a lot of attention. Before we move forward with that a little bit more, I'll introduce myself for those of you who are new to our webinar series. I am Beck Borchert, the Marine Protected Areas Coordinator for the Gwillimoomagu-Suahan, or KMK. A little bit about us: we were created to oversee the negotiations and consultation process between the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia, the province, and the Government of Canada. We are governed and receive our mandates from the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs, and collectively work on broader nation issues for the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia. These webinars, though, are not a singular effort. We have a team of organizations working with us. Our partners include the Unamaki Institute of Natural Resources, UINR. They represent the 5 Mi'kmaq communities on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. UINR was formed to ensure the sustainable use and protection of natural resources while maintaining Unamaki Mi'kmaq traditions and worldviews. Also a partner is the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq, CMM. They're a nonprofit that works to proactively promote and assist Mi'kmaq community initiatives towards self-determination and enhancement of community. Some other partners include DAL and Oceans North, as well as DFO. On behalf of all of us, we want to welcome you into our webinar. It's our second this year and our second season of webinars. So congratulations to our team and thank you to everybody who's been joining us. We do have to go through a few housekeeping tidbits for those of you who are new to our webinars. And also tonight, it's especially important seeing as we have record-breaking numbers of participants. So thank you so much, everybody, for your interest. This is why we do it, so it's really exciting. The housekeeping: please keep your cameras and microphones off during the presentation. Any questions or comments can be thrown into the chat, which is monitored by our facilitator and will be addressed in the Q&A portion at the end. The presentation portion is open to anyone. We have academia, government, Mi'kmaq community members, and other Indigenous community members as well, just to name a few. But to remind everybody, the last 30 minutes from 7 until 7:30 is specifically for our Indigenous and Mi'kmaq participants. So if that's not you, we'll just ask that at 7 o'clock you sort of filter off and make sure you get your questions in the chat before that. Once you've filtered off, you can come back and view the presentations. They're all available on our YouTube link on the KMKNO YouTube page, and we'll make sure to drop that link in the chat so that you can find it as well. We are going to be recording the presentation today, but we will not be recording the Q&A, either from the full Q&A or the last 30-minute Q&A. That part will remain confidential, and we really hope that this will spark good conversation. As we get ready to move forward, I'd like to make sure we start off the evening properly with opening prayers from none other than Todd Labrador, who is Melissa Labrador's dad. So I'll introduce Todd. Todd is an internationally known Mi'kmaq artisan birch bark canoe builder, whose art can be found throughout North America and Europe. Todd was raised on the Wildcat Reservation in Queens County, Nova Scotia, and grew up surrounded by nature and hearing stories from his father, Charlie, who was the first chief of Acadia First Nation. Charlie was closely connected to the land and was raised by his grandfather, Joe Jeremy, who was a traditional birch bark canoe and basket maker. Todd creates art during the winter months and builds birch bark canoes during the summer months throughout the Maritimes. Todd enjoys spending time with the family and friends, sharing his knowledge and skills, and I would like to add that he has a very, very cute dog who is at Melissa's side right now. Todd is forever thankful to all those who have helped him throughout his journey, and I'm really grateful that Todd's here tonight to start off his daughter's presentation in our webinar series on a really good note. So turning it over to you, Todd. Thanks.
And I'd like to start off with prayer to give thanks to our Creator and to our ancestors for taking care of this Mother Earth and Mi'kmaq and this area we call Pemsik since the beginning of time. So, Great Spirit, we thank you for this day and for helping us come together and learn about and discuss this very important project and vision. The area called Pemsik. It's located in Espoguet, Mi'kmaq, or southwestern Nova Scotia. We acknowledge the land of our ancestors, the Mi'kmaq ancestors, and ask for guidance so that we can take better care of it, so that our future generations can enjoy it. We ask that today's Mawiomi, or gathering, is surrounded by the spirits of our ancestors, from all the 7 directions, also surrounded with respect for everyone. Creator, we thank you. Ancestors, we thank you. Mother Earth, we thank you. Mr. Nogma, all my relations. Amen.
To take it off for the rest of the night, hopefully someone without as loud of dogs as I have, is our facilitator who's going to take care of us, Dr. Heidi Wiegand. Heidi is an assistant professor in management with Dalhousie University. She focuses on leadership development, systemic discrimination, and resiliency. Heidi's got an extensive experience working in First Nation communities and a passion for cultivating self-governing practices and sustainable communities. Heidi's currently exploring the role of cultural resiliency and how we connect socially during the pandemic and how research and workshops develop to cultivate resilience leadership. So I'm thrilled to turn it over to a dog-free room. Heidi, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Beck. I appreciate it. And I'm actually coming from the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. So I just want to thank the communities for hosting ourselves here. We've just been at the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, Girls, Boys, and Two-Spirited gathering. So it's been a very powerful week. So I'm first going to turn it over to Melissa. I'm going to introduce Melissa Labrador. She's a senior UNO conservation and climate advisor for Oceans North and works at Kespuit. Melissa is from Wildcat community of the Acadia First Nation, just outside of Kejimkujik, and has worked for many years with her father, who we just heard from, Todd, to build and demonstrate First Nation practices in traditional birch bark canoes. She was instrumental in the protection of the Ketowak and I'm going to let you do the wilderness areas, and more recently has been focusing on Indigenous-led mosaic of conservation in Pemsik, the land and sea area that stretches from Keji, Tobiak, all the way to the inlets of Port Joli and east of Port Libert. She has worked extensively on gathering information and evidence of Mi'kmaq use of the area, particularly the discovery of shell mines and show use from 13,000 years ago. The documentation of this work and its significance was published in a book by Matthew Betts, who is also joining us today in 2019, entitled Placemaking in the Pretty Harbor, Archaeology of Port Joli, Nova Scotia. Melissa also worked closely with traditional medicines of Nova Scotia and looks closely at the correlation of these plants in culturally significant places. And lastly, very important, Melissa is also an artist and you can find out more about her artwork under 7 Directions Mi'kmaq Art on Facebook. Her art is featured throughout North America, Europe, and the world. And in the upcoming North American Indigenous Games held this summer in Halifax, feature her work as their logo. And Melissa is also the mother of 2 delightful twins. So I'm going to pass it over to you right now, Melissa. That's an extraordinary introduction. So we're looking forward to hearing everything you have to share with us today.
Thank you, Heidi. It's so great to be here and so wonderful to see so many people joining us. The evening isn't going to be heavy on the technical. I actually wanted to be fairly laid back and hopefully lots of opportunity for questions and just getting to know the work that I've been doing for the last few years. Dr. Matthew Betts has joined us and he'll be able to give us a really good idea about the archaeological bits and pieces of Pemsik. Pemsik itself is actually the name for Port Joli. And I decided to use this as the name of the project because Port Joli was the kind of the heart of the area that I originally looked at. So before I get too far ahead, what I'm going to do is actually play a video for you. It's about maybe 11, 12 minutes long. But I think it'll really give everybody a chance to understand the layout of the area that I'm working in and so on. I apologize that my voice is a little off. I'm still recovering from COVID and pneumonia. So I'm going to do the share screen and get the video starting.
Delawisi, Doak a Nivi, Aji Ukwadam, Nabuk Juan. We are part of Mi'kma'ki and located within the Kespuit district. It is here you'll find Pemsik, known locally as Port Jolly, and the heart of the Pemsik Conservation Mosaic Vision. The Pemsik Mosaic Vision is within the Southwest Nova Scotia UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, as well as within one of Canada's priority areas for biodiversity conservation. The early Mi'kmaq, my ancestors, navigated these lands by foot and these waters by canoe that connected the interior of Guestwick to its coastal areas. Current archaeological evidence indicates that Pemsik is a heritage landscape of unique importance which has a history spanning 13,000 years. The earliest archaeological evidence from the region comes from the Save River estuary, where a projectile point was recently recovered and dates approximately 13,000 years. What is understood today and shared as traditional ecological knowledge is because it was everyday life for my ancestors. Through generations of observation, they knew their place and their role on this earth. Their traditions, culture, and spirituality was based on the incredible respect that they had for Mother Earth and all her creations. They knew that their actions, no matter how small, would have lasting effects on their future generations. They lived in a respectful way so that we would be here today. Our traditional ecological knowledge was passed down through generations by waves of oral traditions. That knowledge was infused in ceremonies, songs, stories, and legends.
My ancestors lived here. Their footsteps came and went with the tide. If you listen on the breeze, you can hear their whispers. If you close your eyes, you can feel and see their memories.
This land is important. These waters are important. This landscape is a storybook waiting to be sailed. Let's honor this sacred place.
The Indigenous-led vision for Pemsik is of a coordinated and collaborative conservation area that brings together existing initiatives and works to fill gaps in terrestrial and marine protection. Indigenous leadership and protection of archaeological sites is foundational to Pemsik. Pemsik is a vitally important archaeological landscape where my ancestors made their lives and created their history, my history, for 13,000 years. The landscape of the Pemsik area has changed through time, but it still remains sacred to my people. A mosaic vision of conservation for these lands and waters reflects traditional ecological knowledge by recognizing that there are many layers to an ecosystem that include terrestrial and marine. My ancestors see no boundary between terrestrial and marine spaces. They understood that what happened to one affected the other. Filling conservation gaps and supporting Indigenous perspectives of ecosystem connectivity can help achieve commitments to biodiversity protection, protected areas, and reconciliation. The Pemsik Mosaic vision of conservation works because it includes everyone. Most importantly, it includes Mother Earth and her creations. And it recognizes that our future generations depend on what we do today.
there. So I hope that gives everybody a little bit of an idea on the area and the vision for Pemsik. I haven't, I'm only one person, so I haven't reached all the areas of Pemsik yet. And this is year 3 on really focusing on the Pemsik project. I know when we think about protected areas and things like that and boundaries and things like that, that's a difficult thing because traditionally our people, we didn't see boundaries. So to determine what's the best boundary for the Pemsik vision is, still a challenge because there's many moving pieces, talking to people, to locals, and so on. So for the time being, the boundary simply is the river systems that we chose, the Broad River system and the Sable River inland, all the way to the Tobiatic. When I show you the map in a little bit here, understand that the boundary is not set in stone. It is simply based on things we've known and that we know today. And it may move, it may grow, it may shrink, it may, so on and so forth. Same goes with the marine boundary. I'm looking at extending that right out to I think it's the Roseway Bank. So when I think about this mosaic of conservation for the area and for the vision, it's not about, stopping things within that area. It's about looking together, as a collective, because there's so many people with interest in this area. I'm actually going to share the map now so you have an idea of what I'm talking about here. So the map that I have, and again, it's a work in progress, shows kind of the area, again, following the Broad River system to the northeast and the Sable River to the southwest, right up to the Tobiatic, which is the green in the upper left. And then the marine component goes out, as I said, to the Roseway River. A lot of the last few years has been spent on the ground in the area using an Indigenous lens. So really, literally getting boots on the ground and looking at this area and really seeing it from a different perspective. We know that it's rich in archaeology and the such, but the cultural significance of it really is something that has to be done from an Indigenous point of view. So looking at these spaces and in the places that were known archaeological sites, but really looking beyond that and connecting the dots. The last few years of doing this, the land and the waters has really taught me a lot. There's a lot of interesting things there. People talk about indicator plants, and we've seen a lot of indicator plants that if we see these certain plants in a specific area, we're almost certain that we're going to find something. And oftentimes it's an existing known archaeological site or something that we come across that looks like it should warrant further investigation. To back it up a little bit, the idea of creating something in this area comes from many, many years. I've always been drawn to this area. Since 2000, I've worked on different things in conservation. My mother, who is passed, used to do a lot of environmental work as well. And my grandfather, Charlie Labrador, who was the first chief of Acadia First Nation, also did a lot of work in conservation and in awareness and the such. He also worked many, many years for Bowater Mersey. So I come from a really strong line of foresters, as well as on my mom's side, many fishermen and lobster fishermen and so on. So when I think about this area, this mosaic of conservation, I think about those people that are also in forestry and in fishing and things like that, and how this is a chance to preserve what they have done for generations, not just Indigenous people, but the non-Indigenous people, in a way that we can work together to create something that's educational, but also something that's sustainable that will carry us through the generations to come. The thought about, again, people think about conservation and protected areas and they immediately think that things have to stop. And that's not the case. This is such a special place that it warrants and gives us an opportunity to really work together and highlight it. When I think about the marine aspect of it, I think about, a national marine conservation area kind of being the best fit for that area. Ecotourism would be really drawn to the area because people really love the thought of being able to paddle in a national marine conservation area or to learn about that. So there's many benefits to looking at that as the kind of the marine component. But as you noticed by the map that I'm sharing, there's different colors, and those are existing protections now that are currently in the area. The gray is the crown lands, but all the different colors are the existing things. So when I say it is a mosaic, it really is, because there's so many different colors and different things going on there. So it's about filling in the gaps. It's about trying to, work on expanding those areas that are already existing, and so on and so forth. And it only can be done with everybody at the table in the collaboration of looking at this area. I don't know how the future for this will look, but I can imagine that forestry and things like that would be done together in a very educational way that we can learn from things. Fishing and things like that, I can see that as being an opportunity to team up some of the fishermen with scientists and things like that, learning different things, but also protecting the livelihoods of the fishermen and the forestry people and everybody in the area. So it's not about preventing things. It's about looking at what's in this area and deciding spaces that really need a higher level of protection and spaces that can be learning environments for many people. So it's, it's taught me a lot to be in this area for the last few years. Gataweg and Budaladiek were the two wilderness areas that I helped create just outside of Kedemkujik National Park. And they were smaller areas, but they were very significant to my people. So it was really a treat to work on those a couple of years ago and have them become wilderness areas. The Pemsik mosaic is much larger than that. But this end of Nova Scotia, we have an amazing landscape and we have the ability to work towards good conservation and a good relationship with each other so that we can maintain this amazing landscape and learn from it. So I'm going to let Dr. Betts talk right now. A little bit more on the archaeology of the Pemsik area, and then I'll jump back in.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I just wanted to say how grateful I am that you've invited me to present on this. The information I'm going to be presenting is a result of almost 15 years now. I can't believe it's been 15 years since we first started talking about this, Melissa. But 15 years of collaborative archaeology with Acadia First Nation. So the data that you're going to see presented here is a result of community archaeology. Acadia First Nation students helped us excavate the material. Elders weighed in on what we saw. We gave countless community presentations to council and chief and elders, and it's really a result of that collaborative work. It wouldn't have been possible without a deeply sort of collaborative framework. And so everything presented here is result of that engagement with Acadia First Nation. I'm going to shut off my camera and then share my screen and to start the presentation. So I'm going to give you a short archaeological history of Pemsik, what we knew during the main work on the project is Port Jolly. We knew it was there was a Mi'kmaq name for it, which we finally found, and that is Pemsik. I'm still not exactly certain what it means. It could be warm breeze from the ocean or blown along by winds, but that may have changed as we deepen our understanding of the word. What I'm going to present to you now is an archaeological history from an archaeological perspective. So I'll be using archaeological terms. The Mi'kmaq have their own terms for these time periods, which I hope will be used in the interpretation of this cultural landscape moving forward. What I'm presenting to you now is an archaeological timeline, essentially showing Pemsik and showing the history of Pemsik and Nova Scotia and the Greater Maritime Peninsula in general. What we're concerned with is on the left. What's on the right is the history, cultural history of Newfoundland and Labrador. But what's the big takeaway from this graphic is that these cultural changes are connected across the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So on the left side, we have the Maritime Peninsula. On the right side, we have Newfoundland and Labrador. And they're also connected to climatic changes. So you can see these changes in color are changes in cultural time periods. They're also seem to be associated with changes in climatic variability, but also connected across the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So there is a broad cultural connection across the entire Atlantic Northeast that we can't deny, that I wanted to outline here. There are essentially three major time periods that archaeologists have divided the Mi'kmaq history of this area into. The first is what archaeologists call Paleo-Indian. Indian is a pejorative term, but it's a term still used primarily by American archaeologists and American tribes who still prefer the term Indian. So we haven't changed it in our term, although I prefer the term Paleo-American. That lasted from about 13,000 years ago to about 9,000 years ago. There's another time period called the Maritime Archaic, which we'll discuss, that lasted from about 9,500 years ago to about 5,500 years ago. And then there's a period that archaeologists call the Maritime Woodland, which lasted from about 3,000 years ago, right up until the time Europeans contacted the Mi'kmaq. And this time period is really where people were settling into the landscape and developing the types of material culture that we know of from ethnographic sources and from history and from records. So the types of artifacts you'll see here are a little bit different, but these ones will become quite familiar to you as we go through the history. So the first time period we'll talk about is the Paleo-American period, or what archaeologists sometimes refer to as the Paleo-Indian period. We didn't know about this time period in Pemsik for quite a few years, and it was only until 2019 that we identified this time period in this region. That's not because we didn't think it didn't exist or that people weren't here. It's just that we didn't have the archaeological evidence. The archaeological evidence from this time period is very rare, simply because it's so far in the past. This was a time when glaciers covered portions of Nova Scotia, and the people who lived during this time primarily hunted large game. We think probably caribou, but also probably other large megafauna, and lived almost unbelievably fairly close to the ice edge. It seems like at the Burt near Truro, that people were living very close to the ice edge and exploiting those very rich environments near the ice edge. In the Pemsik area, evidence comes from the Sable River estuary, and the most unlikely site that you could possibly imagine. Most of these very early sites are really deeply buried, but here, a local landowner was walking her dog along the beach and found an eroding, a projectile point eroding out of the beach. This is the Sable River estuary. As you can see, at the time that this site was occupied, approximately 13,000 years ago, this would have been a low river valley, probably a tundra landscape. And this would have probably been a place where you could overlook a small river system draining into the ocean, which would be a good travel route for caribou. You've already seen the projectile point before. Melissa showed it to you. And this is a fairly unique style of projectile point, what people call a Clovis point, with a large basal flute or a large flake removed from the bottom. That's a characteristic of these points, and they occur all over North America during this time period, which is probably between 13,000 years ago and about 10,000 years ago, the style point. It's made on very fine chert, actually a chalcedony, probably not from the Pemsik region, probably carted in from the Minas Basin area, this multicolored chert, and you can see it's highly translucent. It's just a beautiful point. The landowner who found this let us know when we were doing archaeology in the region, and it's the first evidence of archaeological evidence of this time period in Pemsik. The next time period is what we call the early maritime archaic, from about 9,500 to 5,500 years ago. There's not a lot of evidence, archaeological evidence of people in this area during this time period. We know that people were there because there is evidence in other areas of the Maritimes and in Nova Scotia. We just haven't found it yet. This was a time when people, when ancient Mi'kmaq were really adapting towards the development of the coastal ecosystem. They were probably hunting large sea mammals on the coast, also probably swordfish and other aquatic species, probably using large dugout canoes made with a really advanced ground stone technology, and seem to have really started to focus on this developing ecosystem. But unfortunately, sea levels were much lower then. And so as sea levels rise, their sites that were on the coast have become inundated and lost to time. Although scallop draggers and other fishermen who drag the ocean bottom sometimes bring up the artifacts from these people, we just haven't found it yet in the Pemsik area, although I'm sure it existed. It's probably far offshore where the marine protected area may be. The next archaeological evidence we have in Pemsik dates to the late maritime archaic period, around 5,500 years ago to about 3,500 years ago. And this unbelievably or uniquely seems to have come mostly from lake and river systems on the northern border of the Pemsik area. And what's interesting about that is that these people probably primarily lived on the coastline and exploited marine resources, but they also spent a lot of time in the interior, and especially did a lot of ritual activity in the interior, it seems, and left a lot of their artifacts there. And so what we have is the beginning of this interior coast dynamic that seems to have characterized much of Mi'kmaq lifeways in the next 5,000 years. And so that's really starts to develop during this, what archaeologists call this maritime archaic period. And so the evidence we have from this is fairly spectacular. There's still not a lot of bone preservation. It's just too far back in time. But we do have things like these wide hexagonal bayonets that have been found near Lake Rosignol. And these were probably used for dispatching large sea mammals attached to, they're essentially spear points, but also probably used for taking interior game as well, terrestrial game as well. There's these large hexagonal points that have been found near Lake Rosignol as well. And these are really interesting because they're so similar to hexagonal slate, and these are made from slate. Hexagonal points that have been found near the St. John River in New Brunswick and further south along the coast of Maine. So it suggests a large cultural area all across the greater Maritime Peninsula. But of course, there is some evidence of regionalization, and we've got these very unique, seem entirely unique to the South Shore of Nova Scotia, which are these asymmetric barbed, unilaterally barbed bayonets. And archaeologists call these bayonets, for lack of a better term, when they're complete, they look like bayonets that you would put on the end of a rifle, but they were probably used for dispatching sea mammals, although these very, very finely made ones may have been used only for ritual purposes. We also have evidence of stone whale effigies that were used. We suspect that these people were probably hunting large sea mammals. And what's very interesting is that this one that was found on the Mersey River, you can see the mouth here and the eye here. It would have had a large piece that has since been broken. Looks virtually identical to a stone effigy that was found in Port au Choix, Newfoundland. Again, suggesting a cultural connection across the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And of course, we find many small semi-lunar knives, or what archaeologists sometimes call ulus, on Lake Roslyn on the Mersey River. And these were probably used for cutting up sea mammals and other animals, either for scraping the skins or removing the blubber and removing the flesh from these sea mammals. They're very efficient cutting tools. We haven't until very recently found evidence of these people on the coast in archaeological context. But recently in Port Mattoon, we were able to find really good evidence, well, not really good evidence, but some evidence of occupation near the coast. And that was the form of a fragment of a semi-lunar knife. We found that in 2019 during a coastal survey. This was in a completely eroded context, probably a secondary deposit churned up by the waves. But again, it was found on the coastline, so suggesting that further work may uncover some of this material, even perhaps in situ. The next time period that archaeologists look at is called the Transitional Archaic. It occurred for about 1,000 years, and that's the period between the Maritime Archaic and the early Maritime Woodland period. Again, we don't have a lot of evidence of this in this area. It's a very short time period in some regions. We just don't seem to have much evidence for it in this region, and that's not, again, because it hasn't occurred there or there weren't people there. It's probably likely because of the lack of archaeological work and the lack of our understanding of where these sites were located. But the next time period, we have abundant evidence of occupation and really spectacular evidence of occupation. So we call this time period the Maritime Woodland period. And this is really when a Mi'kmaq culture that we know as at the time that Europeans arrived really developed and is really evident on the landscape. People during this time period exploited shell middens, shell clam flats, which they made into shell middens by depositing the refuse from their exploitation of these clams. And these are wonderful deposits. They preserve the calcium carbonate in the shells. Shell middens are essentially trash heaps that incorporate all of the detritus from everyday life that were deposited by the people who made them. But the calcium carbonate in the shells leaches out into Nova Scotia's normally acidic soils, and that neutralizes the acidity and preserves animal bones and artifacts in an exceptional state. And it seems that during this time period, everywhere there was a clam flat, there seems to have been a shell bin in Pemsik. And the location where it seems like the most abundant evidence of this activity is Pemsik itself, Port Jolly Harbor. So in Port Jolly Harbor, there's at least 20 shell midden sites. There were probably quite a few more. We know that some have been eroded. So we did survey starting in 2008 all the way up to 2012, an excavation, and learned a lot about the history of the Mi'kmaq people in Port Jolly from these shell middens. They occur in many different types. The first are large coastal shell middens. Now this is a site which is actually about 300 meters square, about a meter deep of pure shell. You can see this archaeologist is standing at the base of the midden. This is the top of the midden, and almost composed of almost pure clam shells with very little evidence of stone tools, but lots of animal bones. But in some places, so many clam shells that there's virtually no soil development. So this is what it looks like. You can see all the clams that were deposited. And we're talking millions and millions of clams. This is an exceptionally rare type of shell midden throughout the Maritime Peninsula. Archaeologists have speculated that these types of shell middens are the result of people coming together, collecting clamshells en masse as family groups coming together, as a community coming together, and then processing these for later winter storage. And that's why the middens developed so rapidly without many artifacts. However, we did find a lot of pottery and a lot of animal bones, so they are doing other things. In addition to smoking and drying the clams, they're cutting up animals. They're probably having ceremonies and feasting. And we found some evidence of that, and you can ask me questions about that later. There are another type of shell midden that we found, which we call large black soil middens. This is from a site closer to the head of the harbor. It was a very large site. They seem to be somewhat later in time than the big undisturbed shell middens. They tend to have a lot less shell in them and a lot more black soil. Oh, sorry, somebody asking a question? Oh, a lot more black soil. Probably the result of multiple wigwam floors placed over and over again in the same positions. They're very rich with artifacts, especially stone tools, but they tend to be very large, even bigger than the large undisturbed shell middens. They also tend to be the target of pot hunters or collectors in the past. This is one of these large black soil middens, and an archaeologist standing in one of the looting pits created by the collecting. Unfortunately, there are a fair number of sites that have had this sort of disturbance in Port Joli, but not as much as in other areas. And there are many other sites that are protected in Port Joli and are undisturbed. The third type of site are these small interior shell middens, and we call them interior, but they're really only about 300 or 400 meters from the coastline, but they tend to be smaller and have smaller little shell middens associated with wigwam floors. And a lot of times they tend to be associated with these big glacial erratics with the wigwam floors or the living areas sort of sheltered in the lee of these big glacial boulders. Here's another one of these small interior middens. This is a very special site in the middle of a bog, on a small knoll in the middle of a bog, which I'll talk about later, but it's a very special site that had a very interesting feature. So here's the distribution of these types of middens across the landscape. The large coastal middens, the big undisturbed ones, there's only 3 of them known in this area, and they all occur in Port Joli Harbor. In fact, there's only 3 of them known in all of the Maritime Peninsula, and they occur in Port Joli Harbor. So in the excavations we did, we got a lot of radiocarbon dates. Some of the features date to about 1,500 years ago, which are just at the transition from what we call the middle maritime woodland period to the late maritime woodland period. And of course, other features are dated later than that. What's really interesting here in this area, you'll see, is that we have one feature, essentially a wigwam floor that spans nearly 1,000 years. The wigwam floor itself was placed in the same spot for almost 1,000 years, which shows a remarkable connection to a specific space on the landscape. But the big takeaway is that as soon as clam flats developed in Port Joli Harbor, the Mi'kmaq came and they stayed right up until the arrival of Europeans and even beyond. It's just that portion of the archaeological record is very ephemeral, and we weren't able to radiocarbon date it, but they stayed right up until they were essentially pushed away by Europeans. So here's a distribution of these sites by time period. So you can see that the earliest sites tend to occur on the southern area, southwestern portion of Port Joli, and the later sites tend to cluster near the head of the harbor in the northern area of Port Joli. And that's probably because as sea levels rose, the productivity of the clam flats changed, and sort of the better clam flats developed over time closer to the head of the harbor, but also because as time went on, it seems that people were exploiting more terrestrial resources and riverine resources, which are more abundant at the head of the harbor as well. So here's one of these wigwam floors that we excavated in the area where we know that a wigwam floor was placed for 1,000 years in the same spot. And you can see here the outline. It's difficult to see, but there's an outline provided by string. The door was here. You can see the shell midden was sort of trampled in. There was a hearth in the middle, a pit feature here. That was a test excavation we did earlier on, and a big anvil stone around which we found lots of spirally cracked mammal bones. They were probably using the stone to break open the mammal bones to get at the marrow inside. We found really good evidence in this feature of a spatial division of labor. So on one side, we found evidence of stone tools and the production of stone tools. On the other side, we found evidence of scraping and use of ceramics. And so this bilateral division of space, which may be related to how the wigwam was organized, maybe men on one side and women on the other side, or at the very least, a task-specific designation. On one side, they did one thing, on another side, they did another thing. In that special site in the bog, we found something that was really important, and the community was really impressed by this. And this such a feature has never been found or excavated in Nova Scotia before, and that is probably, we think it is a sweat lodge. And you can see here this basin shape, this bowl shaped feature with a large a pile of stones in the middle. We didn't know exactly what this was when we first excavated, but we went to the ethnographic literature and we talked to elders. And what it seems to have been was a small wigwam with a pile of stones that were heated and then brought in. In the ethnographic literature, sometimes it's described as people smearing sodorifics or medicinal pastes onto the stones, the heated stones, so that they could inhale this medicinal vapor for a medical benefit. Here's a better picture of the stones. You can see on this side that there's a small paving of cobbles. We found some charcoal at the bottom, but not much else in terms of artifacts. So we know that it wasn't used as a house feature at that time, but more likely as a type of a sweat lodge. But what's really interesting is that over time, houses were built on the site, and they incorporated this rock feature into the later wigwams. There's an aerial view of it. These are the sorts of artifacts, just thousands and thousands of artifacts that we recovered from Port Jolly. These are all since been returned to the Nova Scotia Museum. Some have been put on display by Acadia First Nation, but they're there awaiting further use by Acadia First Nation and others. On the left side, we have projectile points, a vast array of projectile points. A lot of quartz was used. And on the right, we have scrapers. And some really interesting pottery that we recovered from Port Jolly with styles that don't occur elsewhere. They seem to have a very regional decorative style in Port Jolly, which we were able to identify. This is a cord rack, what we call cord wrap stick or splint wrap stick. But this is a unique form of decoration that we've never seen anywhere else in the Maritime Peninsula. We had a ceramics expert, a decorations expert, come and look at this, and they determined that what it is probably knotted cord. And so you can see the little knots pressed in with some, and occasionally you can see a little line where the cord was linked. And so they used knotted cord to decorate this pot. We've never seen that before anywhere.
Thank you, Matt. It's always mind-blowing to see the archaeological evidence and things, and knowing that it's such a special place in Pemsik. I think I just wanted to share that there's a lot of support, and people have been coming and talking to me, and I've been talking to community members and people in the Pemsik area, and as many people as I can possibly talk with. And this mosaic approach has been done elsewhere in Canada, but not in Mi'kma'ki. And there's a great discussions underway with doing a feasibility study with Parks Canada, CWS, and also and also the Port Mattoon Island. I know it's privately owned, but I think that's important to the Pemsik Mosaic as well. So there's a chance that we could look at purchasing the island as part of that. So it, stays in the community for the community. But the project really is about connecting ecosystems and telling the whole story of the landscape versus little pieces of it.
The United States. And what Putin has done is split us apart. We'll just double check that everybody's got their mic on. And thank you.
Thanks. And so it's about connecting the ecosystems and, things like that, but it's also about connecting cultures. Whether you're Indigenous, Mi'kmaq from the area, or non-Indigenous from the area, it's important that we are all part of this Mosaic approach. And so it's really, to see the support for this and the momentum for this is very encouraging. Everybody has been so positive, all levels of government, community members, and so on and so forth. I think because they realize, we're at a time in, our life on this earth that things are changing rapidly, and we realize that we can't keep going the way that we are going. And so I know an hour is not long enough to talk about this, but I'm still, reaching out to people and would love to have people sit down and talk to me about the areas and knowledge that they have, because there's so many people that have different knowledge skills on this. I don't know if to pipe in there or Todd, my father's on there too, because I know we're going to go into the Q&A session. But
I'm always in awe when I see this. It's amazing. The video footage is amazing, and so much. It's a powerful area, and and we are in a time now that everyone knows that Mother Earth is hurting, and we need to help her. And I think this is a wonderful way that we can, and people from all walks of life can come together and work together, and create something beautiful for our future generations and for our present generations. And thank you. Beautiful. I really enjoyed the information on the archaeological evidence as well. Thank you.
Yeah. So again, like I said, an hour is not long enough, but I do hope to bring this information and share it more throughout the next year. The plans is to start with the field work again on the area, and to go from there. I will make sure that the video that I shared at the beginning that folks may have not seen is part of the kind of packet that goes out after the fact. But if you see me in the Port Jolly or the Pemsik area or any of those areas, do say hi, because I'd love to connect with more people as we do work this summer.